Noel Pearson, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Sarah.
You've been highly critical of the role of previous Prime Ministers. Has Anthony Albanese finally gotten it right?
You know, I watched his speech at Gama on the weekend and I was extremely moved by it. I thought he was speaking to the people I love. And it was a tremendous speech.
What is it that moved you particularly?
I think his connection with Aboriginal people, but also he was, I think, speaking to all Australians about the opportunity here with constitutional recognition of a voice. I didn't know that he could connect with me in that way, but I was certainly extremely pleased that that was really the kickoff of the campaign for recognition, and he couldn't have done it better, I thought.
Something struck me listening to it, and it actually made me think about the long argument that you've been having for recognition of Indigenous peoples in Australia. In those 3 draft sentences that he put forward for the Constitution, there is no mention of recognition. Would that have to change for you to support it?
His preliminary words, if you have a look at the speech, the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, I think that they're important words to retain as the prelude to those 3 substantive sentences. And I think those words that he used in his speech would complete the what words should be considered for amending the Constitution. In my view, that would add that element, Sarah, of recognition and make it very clear that the voice is our expression of recognition that we agree to put in the Constitution.
Let me just ask you that then. Is it important whether it is spelled out, or is it enough that it is implicit in the idea of a body that becomes a body to advise the Parliament? Does it have to be there, that phrase, the phrase of recognition?
I think it is. It would adorn the substantive words. I think those introductory words of the Prime Minister would adorn those 3 sentences that he spelt out, and those words are in his speech. But those 3 sentences, for me, constitute the detail that we have been waiting on and that people have been talking about uphill and down dale in recent months, but over the course of the past few years, everybody's been saying, where's the detail? And I would say the detail is in those 3 sentences. And I think what we need to focus on, and I'll say this now because you've asked the question about recognition, the 3 questions of detail that we should all ponder when we look at those words are these. 1, would this proposal meet the challenge of recognition? Would it achieve the kind of recognition that we want of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in our Constitution? That's the first question of detail. Does it satisfy the recognition criteria? Secondly, does it accord with the idea, is it consistent with the principle of parliamentary sovereignty? That is, that at the end of the day, the role of the Parliament is not in any way affected by this provision. And the third question for us to examine in relation to these words is there any unintended consequence that might arise from putting this new provision into the Constitution?
Let me ask you this then. Is it the case that for many First Nations people, that they are more interested now in the practical outcome of the voice, even if it means perhaps getting no specific language on recognition?
I think that the practical dimension is the kind of yin to the yang. This needs to be both symbolic and it also needs to be practical. And my view is that a voice will achieve both. It will symbolise the recognition of the voices of the original Australians, but it will also result in better laws and policies. This will play out. The Constitution is the apex of our country. It's the top of the citadel of the country. And it'll play out in practical ways on the ground for the betterment of local communities.
Let me come down from the citadel for a moment and to politics, where this will inevitably end up. Since it's widely believed that you can't pass a referendum in Australia without political consensus from the major parties, what is your take on the politics of this, particularly from the opposition?
Well, the idea of a voice is in fact, the history of its development is in fact a constitutionally conservative origin. It was actually hammered out in a process involving leading constitutional conservatives. This isn't a proposition that has its origins in a leftist proposal. And in my view, this is the formula for success, because we need constitutional conservatives and conservatives and liberals generally to join this journey to complete the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
I observed that Peter Dutton used some of your own speech in his opening to Parliament, talking about the three narratives of Australian life. But my question is, do you have any insight into how committed Peter Dutton is?
I met with Peter Dutton last year in face-to-face. I've made it my business to talk to conservatives and liberals. I spoke with a great number of people from the Liberal and National Party room over a 6-month period. I tried to get around and talk to as many of them as I could. And I met with Peter Dutton face-to-face in Brisbane. I've known Peter for 20 years, you know. His sincerity about the practical dimensions of Aboriginal life in communities and in the suburbs, in the families, in the homes. I know the guy. He is absolutely sincere about that. And
does that give you confidence that he could support this proposition made by the Prime Minister?
I think that this is a modest proposition, modest but profound, capable of being consistent with liberal and conservative thinking. But so yes, I look forward to speaking with him again now that we have a set of words. We actually have some detail now. We have the detail that was missing, and Prime Minister Albanese has now laid them out there. This really, in order to succeed, we have got to kind of rise above the culture wars. We're going to rise above our tribal divides and see that this is the one question. This is the one question that requires Australians to make common cause. Because if we make common cause on this, we will make our country better.
Last year you gave a speech about the progress towards this point, and you laid out a different timetable. You wanted to see the legislation first before we moved on to a referendum. Are you prepared to support a timetable that goes referendum first, where we answer the basic principle question first?
I think by the time we go to a referendum, I believe the government will lay out more detail, the legislative detail for the voice. But the task we have as an Australian people is to look at this provision, read this provision that Albanese has laid out at Garma on the weekend, and ask ourselves the question, is this the kind of recognition we want? Is this a provision that respects the sovereignty of the Parliament? And in my view, it absolutely does. it's one of the strengths of the proposition the Prime Minister has laid out, that it respects absolutely the supremacy of Parliament. And the third thing that it does is that there is no unintended consequence that can arise from this provision. So we now have a very elegant and I think going to be a very effective way in which we can move forward on recognition.
On that note, Noel Pearson, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for having me.